Our next speaker is Sandro Canovas, who also keeps me in good supply with bottles of Sotal, so thank you, Sandro, for being here today.
Thank you, Evan. Yeah, that's true. The other part of my life surrounds around the tradition of Sotol, which is also going through appropriation these days, like the ADOBE, because the Mexicans are not enforcing the denomination of origin. And I have two disclaimers. One, I don't consider myself an expert on ADOBE, but I get to play a lot with mud. And the other thing is I haven't done a presentation in a very, very long time, so I had a lot of material, and I split it in two. The first half is the current projects that I do that are going to lead to the second one, so you can understand why the phenomenon of gentrification and the position of taxes on ADOBE homes, and how I handle and how I navigate through the problem that we're facing in rural West Texas. Okay, so that first photo is from probably 2008, when I was studying I was part of the last generation of a construction certificate on the Northern New Mexico College in El Rito, New Mexico, really close to Abiquiu. So that's when the first times that I started facing building codes, I decided to get a little more serious, and I asked for a scholarship, and I was granted a scholarship one of the 2 semesters that the certificate, the duration of the certificate. That is the first Don Santos Chavez, and he is the first adobero that I've ever worked in La Junta de los Rios, and that's in Ojinaga, Chihuahua. One of the things that we've been talking about with the cultural landscapes is the situation of a place, of a landscape. I happen to be very lucky that I live in an area that we have a river that bridges 2 countries. So the dynamics of adobes are always switching from one side to another. And that's Don Santos Chavez. And that story led to my apprenticeship for 11 years with ADOBE Alliance, it was a small nonprofit led by Simone Swan that taught ADOBE construction. She was a student with Hassan Fati in Egypt in the 70s, and that type of vault that you see there is the Nubian vault, and it's the oldest vault that we have in human history. That's the inside of one of the rooms in the house. I remember that the first time that I walked into that room, I got completely seduced by the elegance and the simplicity of the catenary curve of the ADOBE. And that's one of the views of the house on the front. And that's Jesusita Jimenez, an adobera and a master vault mason. Usually the craft of ADOBE has gone into plastering, but she's the only woman vault mason that I've had met in that area. And she's still alive. She lives in Presidio County. And these photos that I'm going to continue to show are the eldest adoberos that I started approaching during my learning in my first years. And his name is Don Daniel Camacho, and he was the recipient of a project by Simone Swan, by ADOBE Alliance. And while I was doing a documentary on the adoberos, on Simone and Jesusita and all the adoberos, I convinced him, I asked Don Daniel, why don't we rebuild again your old kitchen? Because they had replastered all what has happened with a lot of the adobes is everybody started plastering with cement, which is the worst thing that you can do. So I convinced Don Daniel, and one day when I arrived, he was already putting the foundations. And we put the foundations with stone and mud, and then adobes that he had made. And I usually try to invite friends of mine that have mastered something around ADOBE or vernacular architecture, and that's a friend of mine who was living at that moment in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and she came all the way to help us build the vault. And it's the first, she has been in Presidio County for five times already. And that's how the the kitchen ended up being. It shifted a little bit on the original shape of the kitchen, which that was the house. That was the original house. But this time, he told me that he wanted a little bit lower. And instead of the vault being with adobes, he wanted it with fire bricks. And that's the kids in the neighborhood. You know, something that was beautiful about that project is that their parents, their moms would come and tell me that they remember doing the same thing that their kids were doing these days when the house of Don Daniel was built. And that's a documentary that I did in 2016 with Don Manuel Rodriguez, and on the left you're going to see the Rodriguez families. The only one that is still alive is Jose, the one with the beard, and Don Manuel and Victor already passed. And that photo, you might recognize it from the poster that I put over there, is the one that I've been using to promote the campaign against the taxes on adobes in Presidio County. So that's Don Manuel and I talking about how many adobes for vaults we're gonna be making for a project. The Nubian vault, which is the adobe form that you see on the bottom of my foot, it's a type of adobe that I had never seen, but Simon introduced in the early 90s, Simon Swan did. And that's this is one project that I'm nowadays consulting, very interesting project near Laredo, Texas, just outside of Mirando City. This is a traditional ceremonial center for the Native American church, and it links a couple of organizations, but it's called the Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative, and it's going to be a conservation place. It's 605 acres where different tribes are going to be able to come and do their ceremonies. And we're using adobe. That's Dr. Terry on my left, who's the world leader expert on peyote conservation out of Sul Ross University, and Mr. Andrew Saw, who's the president of the Native American Church. And that's also, that day, delegation of 9 Huichol Indians came from Mexico to lead the peyote hunt. So it's very interesting because we're using the adobes and the vaults to do the building of the project. That's one of the 2 adobes casitas that I'm restoring right now in Marfa. That photo was taken the last couple of weeks. That's the apprenticeship that I have and a couple of volunteers, kids that they just came and asked if they could help. And I love that photo because that tells you a little bit of the intimate moments that people have when they're working together. And the kid happens to be the son of one of my adoberos in Ojinaga. And that's another house that we are restoring. And a photo of all the local colors of clay that I have harvested within 70 miles from where I live. The only one that it's not from there is the very bright orange that it's above my head. And that one, I brought it from the bottom of the Copper Canyon like 3 weeks ago, from the town of Orique. And those are some colors of clay that I get to play. And I do exchange with people. They come and help me make adobes. I go help them. That's a friend of mine that saved, she bought this adobe in auction. And these are the adobes that we're making for a community garden wall. And that's the next project that I'm going to be doing in May, which is Officers Quarters 7 in Fort Davis. It's one of the buildings there. And I do some altruism, and I bring a lot of donations to the Raramuri communities. The Tarahumaras we have in the state of Chihuahua. The Tarahumaras are one of the 4 groups in Mexico that use the peyote as a sacrament, and they live in below poverty conditions. So I have friended them for years, but my intention is to convince some property owners that they allow us to change these shacks into small adobe buildings. Yes. Okay. So this is a photo of how you traditionally stack adobes that allows the wind to go through them, and they last for a long time. And this photo is about the 5 minutes of fame that I had 2 years ago when I got to tour Anthony Bourdain, and a lot of people recognize me and they tell me how it was, and I got to show him, to convince him, and I dragged him into Ojinaga, so they didn't really did the TV show about Marfa. And that's us having burritos, and yes, we were having sotol at 11 in the morning. Yeah, I showed up with a flask, and he told him, don't worry, just drink it. And it's a confession. I'm one of those Mexicans that when I see signs like this around in Marfa, Alpine, Presidio, my eyes go like clink, because I always have something to do with it. I wanted to show these, so if anybody knows where Presidio County is, this describes the geographic area. We call here in Texas, we call it the Big Bend area. In Mexico, we call it La Junta de los Ríos. It's where historically, for example, Cabeza de Vaca, spent some time. The socioeconomics of the place where this gentrification is occurring is, for example, 70% of the county is Mexican or Mexican American. Some people like to call that indigenous population. The median income is between $19,000 and $24,000. It's one of the poorest counties of the state and probably the country. And as I wanted to include these photos of adobe landmarks that we have. This is the Church of Ruidosa. David Keller, who's the senior archaeology researcher of Sul Ross University, gave it to me a couple of days ago. That's for Lytton, that it's managed by the National Park Service. And that photo this morning was sent to me from New York by the Judd Foundation when I requested some photo of the adobes, because I told them I wanted to talk about the current presence of adobes in Marfa. So Judd, even though Judd arrived to Marfa to build these humongous cement structures, he was aware that the adobe was the original building material. I went back to Don Santo Chavez because he is the first adobero I've ever worked, and the elders that I am still very lucky to have in my life. That's Jesusita, who taught me how to build vaults, and Don Efren, that showed me how to lay bricks correctly. This man over here, it's local historian Enrique Madrid, and I went to see him 3 days ago, and that video that you get to see that I have in my hand, it's a wonderful VHS tape that somebody made called West Texas Adobes from the Ground Up by an organization somewhere in Austin. And I brought it with me. I want to see if somebody has a digital file of it. Here I wanted to quote Simone because she had a vision of what was happening there. And I think that one of the biggest problems that I have when I teach adobe construction is to try, it doesn't matter in which context you teach it, is that people usually relate the adobe to poverty. And what is very interesting that with this imposition of adobe taxes in Marfa, where in Marfa, now if you have an adobe, you pay 57% more than a regular building material. Because when you do an appraisal of a building, always you do the condition of a building and the area, the square footage, never the building material. This is the only place in the world that a tax on the building material exists. 2 years ago when I went to the Earth Building Conference in Santa Fe and I brought it to the table, everybody was mesmerized because usually when you build with green materials, you get a tax credit. In Presidio County, you get punished. And this is the first poster I've ever did with a photo. Too bad that it's not clear, but a friend of mine who he's a Chicano that lives in Presidio but has a small casita in Redford, is his grandfather making ADOBES in Alpine, and those buildings in the back, it's all Ross University. And he gave me permission to use it. So this is the first flyer I ever did, and I would go in the churches really early on Sundays and give it to everybody. And then I decided to make these posters. I contacted a very famous graphic artist and rapper and musician in Mexico City, who's a friend of my youngest sister. And I told him of the situation, and I said, happens that I have these ideas. I asked Don Manuel if he would pose, and he said yes. And I made some sketches with a photo. I put things up and down. And I said, but I need it in Spanish and English. So he gave me this. That's the original photo the day that I took, and Don Manuel during the documentary. Oops. And that's the one in Spanish. This is what I do. It's like Bansky. I put them at night. Nobody knows. Well, everybody knows that it's me, but they've never got me. And yes, I try to make a point of what's going on, and I put them on ADOBES all over town. And this is the ADOBES Political It's Afraid that Simon started using a long time ago. And it says, ADOBE is destined to be politically questioned. Building codes are to be legally corrected through the southwest of the US, beyond. ADOBE construction obtains no bank loans. It should, and it will. ADOBE will be increasingly more of a political issue. As building materials rise even higher in cost than the first decade of the 21st century, as industrial materials toxicity is perceived, as the cost of transportation increases with the price of fuels, as the climatic comfort of salubrousness of ADOBE walls are discovered, more budget-conscious dwellers will drawn to the material. I would never imagine that 13 years later, this thing that she was saying was actually become reality, And I think this is a funny cartoon that I found one day in Simon's drawers that I sent to the Director of Rural Development of USDA requesting an interview, and he replied yes. And usually the preoccupying stuff about what is happening with the ADOBES is that we're used to talk about gentrification in urban settings. It's always in cities. I had never heard that we're dealing with this in a town of 2,000, where people are coming from all over the world and turning the little town into their playground. And I kind of pointed three things that I think are part of it is because the greed that the appraisal district didn't know how to compensate their appraisals, the cultural amnesia that we suffer as community members, and the vilification of the earth building materials. These are photos of some ADOBES. I lived on this one for a while. I was gonna restore it. This is what happens with these taxes. It doesn't allow all the ADOBES to be restored because the moment that you restore them, you get taxed more, or new ones to get built. So some people are demolishing them or turning into this, And it might be familiar when you see the Donald Judd aesthetic, but going to this, turn an old ADOBE into a cement bunker, it's something that I cannot really handle. And what I do is I give free workshops whenever I can. I save some money. This is a workshop that we did in November. As a tool, I do radio interviews from friends of mine that specialize in certain earthen constructions, and I fly them over, and we talk. I invite the elders too. The elders is a little tricky because they get very shy. And that's my great-grandfather and my grandfather. Reason why I landed with the ADOBES because my great-grandfather had brick factories in Mexico City, and so my grandfather. And this is a quote that I wanted to use because it's by a friend of mine who's an advisor to the UNESCO on earth construction heritage. And it talks about the permanence and what traditions are important. That's it.